Hello and welcome back to my channel. My name is David Novak. I thought that today I would do something different, something much more standard booktube-y. The title of this video should be something like the 10 best books ever written, something to that effect. If you spend any amount of time in BookTube, you will come across this sort of title. It may be phrased that way. It may be phrased, the 10 books you must read. You absolutely have to read these. So as a little bit of a disclaimer, I should say that when I say the 10 best, what I mean and what people generally mean is these are 10 books that I think were kind of good, pretty good. What I'm not doing is coming up with 10 books that have had a real special import to me, although some of them have, admittedly. I might put a link in the description box and refer you to a set of videos done by Steve Donahue called The 100 Greatest Books Ever Written, or the 100 Greatest Books of All Time, something like that. And every book on that list is worth reading, I am sure. Were I to attempt something of that sort, well, as John Davids said recently in a video of some recommendation by him, were I to say the 100, that would probably amount to half of the books I've ever read in my whole life. So there you have it. So I will just, there is no particular order to this. Whoops, it just kicked over my tea. No particular order here. And as any avid viewer of my channel might guess, I am going to start with Moses Finley. Now, this is a book that had a very important influence upon me. It is called Ancient History, Evidence and Models, and it's just a little bit of a discussion about the practice of history, what we can know, how we can verify anything that we know as possible or plausible, when can we make conjectures from the silence, as was his favorite term, that kind of thing. But for me, anything by Finley may well be more up your alley, and for more just conventional essays, because that requires a sort of specific interest into the mechanisms of historiography or history writing. But for just some essays, I would highly recommend this. It is subdivided into 3 parts, which touch upon his themes of favor, the ancient city, the slave trade, and I guess property. Anyhow, I haven't looked at this for a long time, but I would highly recommend the essays in here. But they're they're all very specific. And for something a little bit more general and just less aimed at the historian and more aimed at the general public, this book would be a marvelous compilation of different essays. So I said I was going to have honorable mentions. Well, we have begun, and you have not seen anything yet because there is a whole slew about to. And this is just for one book. So about 13 months ago, I read this. And this book was an important book to me when I was young as well, although I didn't understand it. And I thought I should put an economics title in here. I think it's important to know a little bit about economics. And this was revised. Now let's see. I think it was revised in like 1985. This edition is 2007, something like that. And it's a work of economics that sort of brings us into the present day. What is that phrase by Noam Chomsky? Manufacturing consent. I've never been able to read Noam Chomsky's prose, but the concept of manufacturing consent is very important to our economic system, or as he would call it, the planning system. And so it's just a very good introduction into the economic structure of modern day society. Now, I am a little bit leery about going back and reading old economics. I'm not sure how far I want to. Now, I read this in school a long time ago and had a heck of a time. I didn't understand the basics of it. And I picked this up, and maybe this will be the thing to try if I want to give Marx a second go round. For me, actually, this was a much more relevant read. We are all Keynesians, was the famous phrase by somebody, Richard Nixon, at one time. I don't think we are anymore. So I'm not sure, but just about everything that Keynes wrote is worth reading for its prose. And then a couple that I haven't gotten to. I have not read Ricardo. Of course, you know about my big mammoth Wealth of Nations that has been sitting for 30 or some years. And there again, I just don't know if there's any reason to go back to looking at a work of economics, the tenets of which simply probably do not apply to the world in which we live. So if you're interested in the history of economics, well, that's a different thing. And this is the book by Galbraith, which I never read. I've read multiple other of his books, but this was part of his trilogy, The Affluent Society, this one, and then The New Industrial State. So I've read the rest of the trilogy and not this. It doesn't have a later revision or addition than whatever this was. So that was 85, but this will be stuck with probably in the 60s, I would guess. And, well, I can't. Oh, 73. So that's not so bad. It's not 85, but it makes a difference. And like any good book, it has an advertisement of sorts. I don't know if this folds out. Yes, it sure does. Oh, and look at that. The Classics Club. And I actually have a couple of editions from that Classics Club. Now I'm even more excited about this book. But as far as understanding the contemporary economic system, a book that I have read and can't speak highly enough of is this book by Kwame Nkrumah, Neo-Colonialism. It basically is an inventory about who owns what and that kind of thing. But it's a very eye-opening read again. So that's my economics book. Let's go into novels, shall we? And I think The Plum in the Golden Vase, it's a Chinese novel, I think from around the time of Shakespeare. It comes in 5 volumes of this size with 20 chapters in each. Chinese novels would often be composed in increments of 100. So you would have 100 chapters. The real sad thing about this is 5 chapters were missing. Either they were censored or they got lost somehow and some other hand filled in. And I think it comes around the midway point or slightly after that. And those chapters are just horrible. One would wish, one would hope that the lost chapters would reappear, but it seems very unlikely that such a thing should happen. They're not likely to be in some monastery on the back of some text used for some other purpose. So we have to go with what we have. And I know that on BookTube, The Tale of Genji is real popular. It seems like everybody on BookTube comes upon this at some time. It's been quite a while since I read it. And this is the oldest novel written, so I'm thinking about 800. I was just reading some of the writing of a gentleman from the period, which was written in Chinese, of course. And it was a very nice compliment to having read this, but this is sort of one damn thing over and over, so to speak. There's not a lot of variation. If you've spent time in Japan, you will find a lot of interest there. And I really enjoyed the book. I'm not trying to denigrate it in any way. I, of course, stuck with the Seidensticker translation, but others have their own favorites. And I should add that as far as this, I believe there does exist now a 1-volume edition of it that does not have all the notes. And all of the notes, for the most part, are not necessary to the reading of this. But the David T. Roy translation, I believe, is the preferred one. There are, I think, some various abridgments, but the virtue of this is that it's a lot more fun than the Genji, and of course it has a lot of sex scenes. Every chapter at least has one. So just a very great book. If you decide to read this, you need to have a little cheat sheet and write the names of the characters, and if they have a maidservant, that person's name, and sometimes there will be multiple names, just so that you can keep everybody straight. It really does not present much of a problem as you get into the flow of the narrative. But so that is a novel installment, and I thought I would go with another novel, and I decided to choose a Russian, and I went with Dostoevsky, Crime and Punishment. Last year, I read War and Peace, and it was a great book, probably the greatest novel ever written or something like that. People always put it at number 1 in the lists, and it was very good. But I think ultimately that this is a much more interesting book in a way. I mean, War and Peace, if you've seen any of the adaptations, and I have not seen any, but I have walked past the salon when they were flickering upon the screen, I think you probably can get about as much as you need to as far as War and Peace. War and Peace has permeated society so much that it's one of those books you probably don't need to read to have some familiarity with. This, on the other hand, while you may know the bones of the story, and I sure did not, it has I guess you would say, psychological depth to it, which is surprising. And so of what I've read of Dostoevsky, this is the one I would recommend. A lot of people on BookTube seem to be really big fans of this book, and it's a fine book, not near the level of War and Peace, because it's not really cohesive in the same way, and it's really very much a sort of like a daytime soap opera, whereas War and Peace, at least you have the historical context, and that really helps out the work. The negative side to War and Peace is you've got at the end some final chapters of Tolstoy opining about the historical method and about history and that kind of thing, how events come to take shape. When he intersperses it into the narrative, it's fine, but those final couple of chapters are just deadly. But so for the one Russian classic that I would say is the greatest ever written, I will go with this. I don't use the phrase great generally. I mean, it's a shorthand, but if you watch my channel there too, you know that I find the word great is a word that doesn't really have much meaning for me. I mean, anything written by Gogol is preferable to Dostoevsky, but people generally don't seem to take a cotton to Gogol in the way I did. But then I was a comic playwright, so to speak, and he wrote some comedies, and of course his great, magnificent novel, Dead. The next up is Frederick Douglass, Autobiographies. And for many years, my favorite author of the period was Abraham Lincoln. And Library of America has a 2-volume set of his letters, speeches, and whatnot. And I think it's must read. I think it's marvelous reading. But you realize its scope is a little bit narrow in the sense that it is where it touches upon the Civil War and slavery. It is the white person's discourse about the institution. And so I find when it comes to that period, Douglass is a much better guide. Both of them are impeccable in their prose style. And you'll note it says Autobiographies. He wrote the first one, which brought him to public acclaim. I forget the title of that one. And then he adapted it and added to it. And the second was My Bondage, My Freedom. And the third one was, I think, The Life and Times of Frederick Douglass or something like, yeah, Life and Times of Frederick Douglass. So this volume has all three. You don't really need to read all three, I would think, because he took the earlier one and then added to it. And he did some fiddling around, he tweaked, he added. And so I think that the final one is my preferred, even though it kind of drags a little bit at the end. But this was also very good. I mean, they're worth it, but I really think that the later portions of this are of great interest because of the momentous times he lived through. So, let's see, that is number 5. Number 6, of course, I had to put an epic poem in there, so I went with Dante. Some people might think that, well, one of the Homers or Virgil would do just as well. That's possible. I personally like Dante because there is that little Christian connection. And I should say that none of these books that I decided to choose are either works of drama, to my mind, drama should be seen and not read. Well, it can be read too, but and in many cases, that's the best we can do. And I avoided religious works, so something like the Bible or the Quran or the Bhagavad Gita are not going to be in there. So I thought a little bit of philosophy would be good, and so I brought my favorite, the I-Ching. This is the Richard Wilhelm translation. There is a more recent one that I have not seen, and there are others that I have seen, but of the ones that I have seen, this is an old standard, but I hope one of these days I get to see the more current edition. I don't consult with the book that much anymore, but it's a book of philosophy, and why I chose it instead of, say, Plato is because Plato seemed to posit a kind of philosophy where the philosopher was supposed to be an expert, an elite, in a special position, kind of passing judgment upon everybody else. And this is quite contrary to that. This is just ready-made philosophy that any reader can automatically take and apply to his or her own life, his or her own personal circumstances. So it's really a great book of philosophy. And having to choose, I went with this as opposed to that. This is of course very nice, and I wouldn't say, oh, you should read this, but skip that. But this is an honorable mention too. And getting back to history, I will give you Edward Gibbon. This is I think the most current edition that is available, meaning with current annotations. I did not mostly read it in this. I went with a probably some kind of spurious online copy, or whatever it was that I got, and I resorted to this whenever the text I was using was garbled. As far as I could tell, it followed pretty closely with Gibbon. It didn't have these nice little margin headers or whatever they are called. And I think it's just a marvelous work of history, as, who was it? Dostoevsky said, we all came out from underneath Gogol's overcoat, the story by Gogol. Well, I think modern historians have all come out from underneath Gibbon's overcoat. And it's a marvelous book. It's decidedly difficult to get through and follow, but it gives you a real broad sweep of the time period. It's not only about the fall of the Roman Empire, it's also very largely about everything else that was going on at the time that things were unraveling for Rome. So, very good. I don't think I have a runner up there. And then, I've mentioned this book so many times on the channel, and I finally decided to dig it out, The White Rose by B. Traven. And it is, let's see if I can just give you something. The White Rose deals with the clash between two worlds, the centuries-old rural life of the Mexican countryside and the rising power of American industrialism. It describes the discovery and exploitation of Mexico's oil resources by the rapacious giants of the U.S. oil industry and the destruction of a Mexican Indian hacienda, La Rosa Blanca, which stood in their way, the White Rose. And I am just right now in progress of reading the Mahogany cycle, or the Jungle novels as they are called. And so I am in the middle of the third one, and they are just magnificent. They are distinctive enough separately that they cannot be called one great novel. But I could almost see bending the rules here and saying this is the one to read. But I haven't finished the final three. So hopefully that will be coming and we will get there. But for the time being, I think that this is just a marvelous introduction to B. Traven's writing style. I think the greatest American author of his time, although there is endless dispute about that. So that was 9 books, and the final book that I came up with was the Sonnets. It's just really a magnificent book. I think it's what is it, 154 distinct poems. There's very few clunkers in here, and even the few clunkers are still worth your attention. Personally, as you know, I would probably go with John Keats, but then you're relegating yourself to just 9 or 10 poems, something like that, whereas here you've got a whole book full of them. And as far as poetry in English, as far as the sonnet form itself, you can do no better than this book. So on to the final honorary mentions. I feel that one should not pass through this life without some kind of contact with Cicero, or as some people like to say, Cicero. And I think he is best encountered through either his letters. Penguin had 3 volumes, letters to Atticus, and then 2 volumes of his letters to other friends, or his speeches. And Penguin has a nice compilation of his speeches. I really like his orations. I think the first and the last may be the most famous. It's been a while since I've read these, but these are all orations. They call them Philippics because I think it was Demosthenes gave a bunch of orations against Philip of Macedon, maybe. I have not read those, though I have the volume. And so that's how they did things in the ancient world. I guess they would call these Philippics then. But he's, of course, denouncing Mark Antony and ultimately paid dearly for it, paid with his life. But the speeches are marvelous. He was not always an admirable character, but in the end, he raised himself to the level of the best and the greatest. I think John David called him a gas bag or something like that. He was reading the really nice biography by Anthony Everett. I have another biography of Cicero by the guy who did the translation, R. Shackleton Bailey, and I thought it was very good. It's a very good companion for you if you are going to be reading Cicero's letters. And as my final honorable mention, I had a mentor named Marcia who died, and I inherited a couple of her books, Ulysses by James Joyce, and her edition of the Autobiography of Malcolm X. And I think this is really, for anybody living in America, it's a must-read book. It's just a really marvelous bit of memoir about one man's experience or experiences living underneath the system of racial inequality and injustice that has obtained in this country for a long time. And it's really a marvelous read. So that is my 10 books and then some. I am just going with the flow of BookTube fare, trying to fit in a little bit better. So again, I am not saying that I am the final judge of this kind of thing, and I am not saying that you are not going to be able to easily compile your own list. But I thought that, what the heck, people are asking me, what else you got, Dave? So I thought, well, I might as well pile something together real quick like. Thank you very much for stopping by my channel.